again turned out of a little piece of cow bone. You can see what I do is simply square one end of the piece, and that jams into a square hole to drive. And then I just use a little beeswax on the center point on the other end to lubricate it so it spins freely on there. The basic design for this wood lathe is inspired by illustrations I've found going back as far as the 17th century, even with all the metal screws in it. But the idea for powering a wood lathe with a hand-pumped hoe goes back as far as ancient Rome. Of course, they had much larger foot-powered lathes available by the Renaissance. What would have been most common by this time is a spring pole lathe, where you'd have a branch or pole mounted above you as a spring, a cord tied to that, wrapped around the piece to spin it, and then tied to a foot pedal down below. Those were big enough for turning things as large as chair and table legs, eating bowls. I started out working with something similar to that, but in my research, I started seeing illustrations of these little tiny hand-powered lathes, and I thought it worked much better for the really small things I wanted to turn, like little game pegs and little toys, sewing tools and things. And since I started working with this lathe, I've actually been able to document the use of a bolt-powered lathe for turning chess pieces as early as the 13th century. Or down below from the same manuscript, he's turning game pieces for the backgammon board the other man's making. Of course, the earliest known illustration of a wood lathe comes from an Egyptian stone carving about 300 BC. There you can see one man is pumping the rope back and forth to spin the object while the other man's doing the cutting. Of course, not long after that, they came up with the idea of using a bow. There, the uprights are actually buried into the ground to hold it steady, so you're squatting on the ground looking at there.
That's cool.
Because by the Renaissance, wood turning was a specialty trade. The turners had their own craft guild separate from the other woodworkers. And simple turned objects were fairly common in the households at the time. Simple eating bowls and drinking cups. Of course, some of the furniture in the more wealthy households. Of course, you can see one of the problems with this is the back and forth motion. I can only cut on the downstroke, or as my wife tells me, I'm only working half the time. So it takes a bit.
Is that an innuendo?
Thank you.
So it takes a bit of practice to get that rhythm down with the back and forth motion. Fortunately, since I had started out with that big spring pole lathe, I already had a sense of that back and forth motion, so it didn't take long to catch on to doing different things with different hands. This one. Of course, when I'm turning the bone is quite a bit harder than the wood, so it takes me about twice as long to turn something in wood compared to working in bone compared to working in wood. But I really like the details and the finish I can get out of the bone pieces. I have to touch up the edges on my tools much more often when I'm working in bone. One of the differences between working this modern motorized lathe, when I'm turning wood, I find I switch back and forth the direction of my cut much more often to compensate for the flow of the grain to get a smooth cut through the grain. Whereas with the speed of a modern motorized lathe, you can cut through the imperfections in the grain much more easily without having to switch your direction to cut as often as I do with the slow speed I have. Of course, you can see I'm just using a branch here. Normally you have an actual carved wooden bow, but I've discovered I'm a lousy bow maker, and I keep breaking them. So I'm just making do. You can see I've cut notches into the handle so I can adjust the tension on the bowstring in case it's a little too long or too short. And I'm using a hemp cord. Hemp is about the best natural material I've experimented with. I do 3 demonstrations a day here, and this one cord will last me the entire 7 weekends throughout the festival here. Whereas the other cords I'd experimented with, I'd have to replace 2-3 times. Although a sheep gut or a sinew would be a common bowstring as well. Some of the bows I've seen actually seem to have a little nut to adjust the tension on, kind of like in a violin bow. And it's hard to tell from the illustrations whether that's what I'm seeing there. When I first started experimenting with this type of lathe, I would simply center the piece I was turning between the points and wrap the bowstring directly around what I was turning. And it works okay, but it limits how small you can get without breaking the piece off in it, since you got the bowstring pulling on it and of course your tool working against it. But I had seen some illustrations of some of the simple chucks, jam chucks and pin chucks that he used in the supports for them. So I added the center upright and the pulley there, and that allows me to get down to maybe 1/8 of an inch or so if I'm really careful. One of the things I turn often is lace making bobbins, which is what that is. Of course, bow-powered lathes actually continued to be used right up till the turn of the 20th century. I have here a little tiny watchmaker's or jeweler's lathe from about 1900. You can see the brass pad where it'd be clamped into a bench plate to hold it. And then here, a little tool rest there, and it'd be powered with a bow, much in the same way I'm working, for working those tiny parts in handmade watches and clocks. From what I understand, it would be more for polishing the pivot points and the jewels in the watches, as opposed to actually machining the parts. Again, that one's about 1900. That was some of my inspiration to start experimenting with a tiny hand-powered lathe. About the age of 14, and they'd served 7 years as an apprentice and at least 2 years as a journeyman before they could become a master in their own right. Of course, there were occasional exceptions. I found a biography of a 17th century London turner, and it turns out he didn't serve a full 2 years as a journeyman. Well, it turns out his father was part of the governing board of the guild, so they kicked in a little extra money to the guild so that he could become the master early. You know, some things never change.
Yes, right. Well done.
Of course, by the 16th and 17th century, wood turning was becoming a fashionable hobby by wealthy gentlemen and noblemen. Even Tsar Peter the Great had a treadle lathe that he played with as a hobby. It was built by one of the engineers of the time, if you will. So it was a nobleman's toy, so very ornate. The original lathe was lost in a fire, but someone in Russia in the last 5 years or so has rebuilt the Tsar's lathe based on surviving illustrations and is demonstrating it in a Russian museum. And I happened to stumble onto them online and trade a little information back and forth. But again, by the 17th century, wood turning was becoming so advanced that they were starting to do what we now call ornamental turning, where they had spring-loaded cutters capable of following patterns, cut complex shapes, or even called engine turning in more complex versions. I've got an illustration here of a goldsmith's lathe. You can see the spring-loaded cutting mechanism, the pattern it follows, and the scallops it's cutting in the platter as it's going around there. That's an 18th century example, but they were using similar things by the 17th century. Or here, these are screw cutting headstocks. Each one of these levers engages a slightly different master thread. So this mandrel or shaft actually advances and retreats slightly as it spins for cutting consistent threads and screws. Again, they were using setups as complex as early as the 17th century, or in simpler versions with a single master thread, and there you can see teeth are filed into the tools to cut the profiles of the threads that you're cutting there. I'd never actually done any turning till I started experimenting with man-powered wood lathes. Of course, now I have a modern lathe at home that I play with, and I've had a chance to do some piecework in my father-in-law's modern machine shop, running a big 6-foot-long turret lathe, as well as a computer numerical control lathe. So I've been able to run the whole range of the technology now, so it's been a lot of fun. In fact, I took the pieces for this to my father-in-law's machine shop to drill and tap holes to make sure I got those straight and threaded properly.
Just one question. Where do you put the batteries?
No. What's your occupation? What do you?
Libraries is my background, so that helped with the research, of course. But I own the booth here. We research games of the past that we sell. So that's making some of the game pieces and little toys is kind of a supplement to the making the games.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much for that.
Welcome.